Well, good afternoon and welcome to our live video here at Concordia Technology Solutions. We are coming in on a different day and different time than normal as we prepare for the Christmas season starting very quickly. It's hard to believe that it's less than a week away before Christmas hits. So this will be our last live video of the year, and we are talking about a topic that is probably a really good kind of Christmas vacation topic because it's about changing processes, and it's not something you want to do right now as you're getting ready for Christmas. So I'm guessing most of you will probably be watching this after the fact. But this is a really great kind of January New Year resolution kind of software to implement at your church. We're going to be talking about Slack today. Slack as a messaging software, not as a way to go about your work. So I am joined by Reverend Bill Johnson from the Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Bill, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing great, Peter. How are you, sir?
I am doing okay. Like we were talking before we went live, this is a topic I'm extremely comfortable discussing because I use Slack every day, and I know you wrote a blog post for our blog about this and have some great insights, so I'm excited to discuss this with you today. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
I'm happy to. It's always fun.
Well, let's start off just talking, what is Slack? It's got such a weird word, and at least in our culture here at CPH, the word Slack is now both a noun and a verb. We'll Slack people things from time to time. Yep. I don't know if it's like that with you guys.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You know, and I got to say, when Slack first came out, I mean, it's sort of that way in the software world where you get a new product. It seems like every other week, every couple months maybe, that this new must-have development tool that you're going to roll it out, you're going to try it, and like 2 months later, it's going to be an icon on your desktop that you wonder why it's installed there. And so I really don't pay a lot of attention to the new hot thing a lot of the time. So I ignored Slack for a good long time, I got to say. And in fact, I actually started using it because we were using it, way back when to communicate blog posts and to coordinate a lot of that. But it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that it's one of those tools that picks one thing and does it really, really well. And in this case, that one thing is instant messaging communication, so text, chatting back and forth. And it's focused around small groups, teams, individual communication. So if we're talking about kind of communication space, it's not as urgent as a phone call, not quite as personal as a text message, but more urgent than an email. So it sort of sits in the center of those things. And it's filled a niche that I didn't actually know we had. As we started using it here in our tech crew and in our PR group here at the seminary, we found it really to be just invaluable for keeping all of the different teams that need to be connected and communicating in some pretty cool ways.
When we first started using Slack, I wondered, well, how is this different than something like AOL Instant Messenger from all the way back in the day, where that was the revolutionary communication tool online? I think that's late 90s, early 2000s. I know even when I was in college, that was still the way to communicate back and forth. And when I first saw Slack, it was full screen. Like Instant Messenger was just up in the little box on the side of your screen, and Slack took up everything. I thought, well, how is this any better than something like AIM? So can you talk through the differences? Like you said, Slack does one thing and does it really well. How is it different from other messenger apps?
I think the big thing with Slack is that it is focused around small team coordination. And I know you can scale it out to an enterprise level, and there are definitely some big companies that use it. But I think where it really shines is that 5 to 10 member team where everybody needs to be able to stay in touch. You may need to be able to share files with one another, pictures, that kind of thing, and be able to have those discussions that don't quite rise to the level of we need to all go down to the conference room and have a meeting, but we all need to have a voice in the conversation and have that discussion. And so whereas a lot of other messaging tools would allow that, Slack allows you to create the channels for that and to have them be persistent. So, for example, I'm glancing, I've got my Slack monitor over here that I use. We've got our general one, but we also have our seminary technology channel and our enterprise resource planning channel and some of these others. And in fact, I've got one in here that is just for the group of us that meet on Tuesday nights to play tabletop games in the conference room. Very important. So, it allows you to keep those things and those conversations to the people that need to hear them, so you don't have noise for others involved. But at the same time, you're able to keep those and keep at least a partial conversational history. If you're not, at your computer at the time, or you don't have the mobile app installed, then you can catch up and still weigh in on the conversation. It's not like you weren't there and you missed it. So there's a lot of things that really make Slack a whole lot better at messaging, in particular for teams. If you're talking just point to point, then yeah, maybe you want to look at Google Hangouts or AOL or even just texting one another. I mean, those are easy solutions and they work. But in terms of small team communication and coordination, Slack is brilliant.
That's excellent. Well, let's talk about how Slack fits into a communication strategy. We talk a lot about communication strategy here at CTS. As we look at Slack, and it's certainly a communication tool, would you see this used for internal communication, like you're talking a small team, external communication, thinking of the church level, the church office to the members, or is it good for both?
Primarily internal, with a few caveats around there. One thing Slack doesn't do well is broadcast. So if you're thinking that this is going to replace, MailChimp or your newsletter or even your Sunday morning announcements, that's probably not the thing, because it requires one more website that people visit if they're using the web app, or one more application to install or mobile app. They've got to be listening there. So unless there's a reason for them to participate in the conversation, Slack's probably not going to be a place where they're paying attention, and therefore not a place to put your information out. But for a small team, and whether that's a small staff where you've got a pastor, an assistant pastor, and a worship planner, or whatever that looks like for you, or even if you're, that, little country church on a hill pastor like I was, where, you're the pastor and the secretary and the janitor sometimes, you still have other congregational leaders that you want to coordinate with. And so often I've seen in congregations, part of what happens, especially in those smaller congregations, is motion only happens during the monthly meeting. The couple days before, people hurry up and do a few things, and then you have the meeting and you talk about it, and then it just sits until next month's meeting. And if it's summer or Christmas or Lent, which I think is actually most of the year by the time we're done there, then those meetings may or may not happen, or, a lot of these things like that. Slack gives you a place where some of that volunteer workforce, some of those conversations can happen around the meeting. So in between, and if you've got a group of trustees that are working on a thing that need a way to communicate and coordinate who's doing what and what needs to still be done, Slack can be an excellent way of taking a very small internal team, even if they're not necessarily paid staff, and still keeping them on the same page and keeping everything moving in the same direction between meetings.
So let's talk about what Slack can replace, because you've already mentioned a few things. I know here at CPH, Slack has replaced most of my internal emails. There'll still be some things that go from groups of people. In fact, usually I find that it's when there's a document that needs to be shared. Even though that can be done in Slack, I still find we typically do that over email. But one thing it's completely replaced is my internal phone calls. We used to always call each other on the phone, and now there's only a handful of people that I ever get calls from. We have a different ringtone when it's an internal call, and I can usually guess who it is when I hear that ring, because everybody else would call or would message me over Slack. Is there any other tools that you think Slack would replace, or maybe has replaced for you?
Well, I think the big one for us is actually the text messaging. And that, of course, we're a small team, we're close, we have each other's cell phone numbers, that kind of thing, fine. But most things aren't that urgent. I don't need you, if you're in the middle of, a power supply battery replacement, I don't need to interrupt you in the middle of that. But I need to fire off a message and get a reply sometime today. And so Slack kind of fits into that space very nicely. I won't say it's completely eliminated our phone calls. We haven't rolled it out campus-wide. We've only got it in a few departments. But the other place that I really see it shining for us is that distributed communication. So for our web team, for example, let's go concrete with an example here. I've got one student worker who's really good with HTML, CSS, so I'm relying on him a lot to do website updates. but I don't know his work schedule, and he doesn't necessarily come up and check in with me because I'm a moving target half the time. So, if I go ahead and throw in the Slack channel, hey, when you get in, can you take care of, this, and this for me? He sees it, he knows it. If he has questions, our PR director's on there, our graphic designer's there. All the tools, all the people he needs are right there. And I don't know that there was a tool that really fit in that niche before. He would have had to go office to office to get the information and material that he needed to get the work done.
That's a good point. When I think about our support team upstairs, when I was upstairs working with them, it was always a struggle to know whether or not they were on the phone with a customer or not. And I would never want to interrupt them by going up over their desk and talking to them that way. And emails always seem to take a back burner, certainly internal emails compared to all the external emails they would get. And so Slack has really changed that, where I can reach out to any support tech, knowing that I may not get an immediate response, but that it's like that proper level of urgency. I really like how you describe that niche place where it is. So great examples. Let's talk from a church perspective. What are the benefits of using Slack? What are kind of the pros, and then we'll get into the cons of using Slack at a church level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the congregation, the big thing is keeping everybody coordinated, everybody on the same page, and a lot of times the resources they need in one place. So document storage is not necessarily Slack's forte. It's kind of one of those things where you can do it, but don't count on it to be your Google Drive, that kind of thing. But a lot of the information, it's great to just have it there in the channel. You can scroll back, see it, all of that. I could definitely see a place for it in a multi-staff congregation where you've got a team that you want to keep coordinated, particularly if you're doing any kind of worship planning together, that kind of thing. It's a great way to let people, as they have the moment, to voice their opinion on, hey, should we play this hymn or this song in this service, or that kind of planning level. At the same time, if you've got a smaller congregation, like we talked about, keeping your council or your elders or your trustee connected to the overall mission and work of the staff is certainly something that could be very beneficial.
I keep wanting to use Slack with our congregation on church council, because there's, like you said, that exact issue of once a month we meet and things get done at that meeting, but there's things that have to happen in between. We still have several people on council who struggle to use email, and I'm not ready to throw a new tool at them, but that idea of throughout the month, having that, those conversations centered on different topics, have an activity, is so appealing to me. Now, in a congregational setting, certainly churches are not the primary market for Slack. In fact, I don't think they've ever targeted churches for that tool. There's some things that might not fit. So what are some of the cons of using Slack in a congregational setting? What are the things that our audience should be aware of that it's not going to be ideal?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing is the same with rolling out any new communication tool. It takes a certain amount of buy-in. I mean, if you roll out Slack and nobody installs it, nobody logs in, nobody uses it, and you send messages, they don't matter. If you talk and no one's listening, obviously you're not communicating. And there's probably a Sunday sermon analogy in here somewhere, but I'm going to walk through that. So that's the biggest thing. The other thing to be aware of is Slack is not a archive of any sort. If you want, it can do it. If you want to have like a message archive that goes back and you can see what you were talking about at Advent last year, then they have subscription plans that'll get you there, but you're going to pay for those, and you're going to pay significant amounts for it. That's their business model, where for corporations that need that kind of thing, that's actually where they start charging. The initial level, and I may be jumping ahead to the end here,
That's
but
all right.
The initial level of Slack is free. And so you can sign in and create an organization, and I think the only limit that I remember right now anyway is that it only archives the last 10,000 messages that you sent back and forth across your whole organization. So if you're counting on being able to refer back, that kind of thing, some kind of permanent record, Slack's not the right tool for that unless you're willing to bust out the checkbook.
Well, and I think that's important to know. Like 10,000 messages, when I first heard, I was like, "Oh, that's a ton. That's months and months." No, it's not. That's the way you communicate back and forth. And I think I noticed that with my text messages when I was like, "Oh, I just texted my wife this the other day," and I scroll and scroll and scroll and realize how quickly that adds up. So I think that's a really good point. We already talked about this a little bit, but as we talk about how Slack fits in the congregational setting, what are your recommendations for how maybe a church can dip their toes into Slack? How do they, maybe if a pastor is watching or the church administrator, what would be a good way to test this out to see if it's going to work for your congregation? Kind of a small scale test.
Sure. Well, and I think you hit on it right there. I would actually start with the pastor and the secretary, and if you have additional pastor or worship planner, those are some great people who need to be in close communication. Chances are you're sending email back and forth a ton, or you're calling each other, or you're even just sitting down together. This might be a way to start with those core people, see if this fits that communication niche a little better. And it really just depends on the congregation. I've been in places and been in relationships with people where you really just need to sit down face to face. That's just the way communication happens, and it works, and there's no sense in messing with that. But at the same time, if you find that this is something that kind of slots in there to a need perhaps you didn't even know you had, then it's worth giving it a shot. Certainly at the price point, you can't pass it up.
Yep.
See what happens with it, and if you're finding it useful there, then look at rolling it out beyond that.
Good. Well, before we end, is there anything else that you would recommend that our audience consider as they're looking at utilizing Slack? Any potential benefits that are kind of a step or two removed from what we talked about, or any potential downsides that you can think?
I don't know there's necessarily any downsides, but keeping an eye on and just watching, what are the channels that get created? It's kind of fun because users can create their own channels, and so you start to get a very organic sense of where's the communication happening within your organization. And so that's been fun to see, as I discovered there's channels that some of our library staff that I work with for doing educational technology course setups, that kind of thing. They're on Slack as part of the tech team, and so we're ending up with some library-based channels that we didn't initially anticipate happening, but are totally things that were necessary and work really well. So being aware of that this can sometimes give you a little bit of insight into the function of your organization that you might or might not have been aware of.
I think it's important to note, too, that there is the opportunity for private channels versus public channels, so you may not be able to see all of it. But I love that kind of organic communication that happens, and we've seen that here, too. And we've talked about strategies of using Slack for our ongoing events versus our one-time events, and then how we discuss that. So it's fun to kind of create those as you go and figure out what works and what doesn't work. Well, Bill, thanks so much for being here today. Thanks so much for writing the blog post. We'll share a link to that in the comments. I encourage you to take a look at that and share any of your feedback. If you are using Slack at your congregation, we'd love to hear how you're using it, what you think of it. And if you're thinking of trying it, let us know. We'd love to hear that too. Join us next year. We'll be coming back for different videos. We might follow a different schedule in the future. We're talking about a few changes, so be on the lookout for that. But for now, I'll say thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day and a Merry Christmas.